So thank you for joining Secure Justice today in the next installment of our podcast series. Today we're going to discuss how national trends regarding public safety, the perception by many in the mainstream that crime is out of control, and how the media amplified narrative leads to tougher on crime policies directing and impacting cities like San Francisco. We're joined today by three amazing guests from right here in the Bay Area that have a front row seat to what we're going to be talking about. Kat Brooks is a KPFA co-host of Upfront. She's a longtime performer, organizer, and activist. I've personally worked with her locally. She played a central role in the struggle for justice for Oscar Grant. She spent the last decade working with impacted communities and families to rapidly respond to police violence and radically transform the way our communities are police incarcerated. She's a co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project and the executive director of Justice Teams Network. She was also the runner-up in Oakland's 2018 mayoral election, facing the incumbent Libby Schaaf. Manohar Raju is a San Francisco public defender and a founding member of Public Defenders for Racial Justice. Son of immigrants from India, his pursuit of justice is rooted in his acute awareness of the ramifications of social inequalities. Despite coming from a farming village, his parents managed to emigrate to America, where they raised Manu on the East Coast. Manu has worked as a deputy public defender in Contra Costa County for 7 years before he was recruited to join the San Francisco Public Defenders Felony Unit in 2008. Due to his impressive practice as a felony line attorney, he was promoted to be the director of training and the manager of the felony unit. Laura Bazelon is a professor of law and the director of the Criminal, Juvenile Justice, and Racial Justice clinical programs at the University of San Francisco School of Law. From 2012 to 2015, she was a visiting associate clinical professor at Loyola Law School and the director of the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent. Professor Bazelon was a trial attorney in the Office of the Federal Public Defender in Los Angeles for 7 years. Prior to that, she was a law clerk for the Honorable Harry Pregerson of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Welcome to you all. Thank you for sharing your valuable time and insights with us. Mr. Public Defender, why don't we start with you, since you really are on the front row of what's happening in San Francisco. You're in the center of these cultural wars that we're discussing. Here in California, we've had statewide legislation to address bail reform. We've had Proposition 47, which downgraded some of the criminal penalties. San Francisco has a district attorney committed to reducing the harmful impacts of mass incarceration. And yet, if a cold or casual reader was to pick up the Chronicle or any other local media, we would think that San Francisco has become the bullseye for all that is wrong with progressive policies. It's a failed city. So let's first talk, work conditions. How is your staff from a morale perspective? I imagine they feel a bit probably like Kat and I do sometimes as activists, that we're always fighting uphill, that there's a never-ending barrage of problems that we need to address. So how is your team doing under these circumstances? Has attrition been a problem?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Brian. To take a step back, I think it's important for people to understand that the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, we're really a world-class public defender's office. Our attorneys, our investigators, our paralegals, our social workers, clerical staff, and IT staff, we see ourselves as freedom fighters who are passionate and dedicated to providing the highest level of representation for our clients. It's been frustrating. Of course, it's difficult when you're trying to practice during, when we just came out of this, and we still are in the pandemic. After becoming elected public defender, I had to pivot to how do we run an office with only 20% allowed in the office. And being a public defender is a very tactile, be there. We emphasize meeting with our clients within 48 hours of the initial arraignment and really spending that time with them. So that makes it more challenging. And on top of that, the courts themselves have been delaying trials that most of our clients are well past their last days, some months, some over a year. And I'm a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the courts in order to, vindicate our clients' right to a speedy trial. And, we feel it's a humanitarian crisis. Having said that, though, we, in part because we're in the pandemic and just because of, I think, the vision that we have for the office, we've been very ambitious. I think it's a very exciting time to be a public defender in our office. We initiated the first of its kind Be the Jury project to increase economic and racial diversity on jurors. Previously, people with hardship off jurors because they weren't financially able to be on that jury. Now, people will get paid $100 a day if they would otherwise have a financially hardship. We got funding from the mayor's office for a groundbreaking Freedom Project because we know that whenever there's a change in the law designed to address the fact that some sentences have been too long or convictions have been wrongful, unless there's a public defender rolling up their sleeves and pushing the envelope to make the law reach its intended beneficiaries, that doesn't happen. I was recently at a luncheon and there were about 8 or 9 people who had been released under Penal Code 1170D, which allows the prosecution to bring a motion to alter that sentence. And for that work to be done, public defenders have to carry a heavy laboring order there. And it was just beautiful to see that many people coming home. And previously that wouldn't have happened. We've grown our budget to address some infrastructure needs, although it has to grow a lot more. We'll get to that later on where, our budget's only about a little over half of the prosecutor's budget. We launched Cop Monitor through the hard work of our integrity unit. And that's the first police record database accessible to the public connected to a public defender's office. Our immigration units filed some class action lawsuits to protect the rights of immigrants who are in horrendous conditions in ICE detention. We've tripled the capacity of our clean slate unit by reaching out to foundations because we know that, public safety or community health is much more possible to attain when people are off paperwork, off probation, and they're able to access jobs and educational opportunities. We've been active in Sacramento where we were involved in changes to gang legislation, bring about change to gang legislation, which has too often wrongly drawn young people of color into the label of being a quote unquote gang member and led to really harsh sentences. We were involved in caps on probation terms for a lot of sentences, for a lot of convictions, both felony and misdemeanors, because of the realization that lengthy probation terms were really interfering with people's ability to move on with their life and reintegrate into communities. And we launched something called the Adachi Project, which is a collaboration with 2 film production companies to start telling the stories that could then thereby help to move policy. So I feel really good about where we're at. We've been extremely dynamic in the last couple of years. And at the end of the day, though, there's always going to be some attrition, but I feel good about the fact that, public defenders are going out and doing things in other places, whether it's working for supervisors or working in policy areas. And I think bringing that public defender perspective to other places is really good for the overall ecosystem of social justice.
So when you like the rest of us saw and heard Mayor Breed's temper tantrum last December, talking about reviving the war on drugs and just, expanding, increasing the policing of the tenderloin, are you starting to fear the worst for your clients?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a day, and I remember my first day doing arraignments. This was in San Francisco. And this was under when Kamala Harris was the district attorney. And there are 13 felony cases on my first arraignment day. And I would say well over half of them were these quote unquote buy busts, where literally we're talking about crumbs. We're talking about, cops showing up and oftentimes giving an addict way more money than the crumb that they had was worth, and then, swooping in and arresting them a second later. These are not individuals, none of them who even owned a car. These are not high-level dealers. Most are addicts trying to support an addiction, and you see just the huge waste of resources involved. Sometimes there's literally 8 police officers involved in literally a minor hand-to-hand sale. It was in coming in and collecting overtime, and the sentences that were being doled out were years in prisons for literally, something that would fit on your fingertip. And that war on drugs has been shown to fail, this quote unquote, it stems from the Nixon era in the 70s, and it's created a climate of fear that dramatically increased funding for police and expanded the penal code, and fueled mass incarceration, mainly targeting Black and brown communities. We need to fund housing, jobs, education, treatment programs, and not more police. But I'm grateful that the community, has come together and pushed back against some of these emergency orders. We filed complaints on behalf of community members who have been harassed by police in the Tenderloin, and we also partnered with other organizations. And an appeals court just struck down the city attorney's attempt to banish 28 individuals who are alleged to have sold drugs in the TL, finding that to be unconstitutional. So, when there are actions like this that I think are going back to failed policies before, it's really good to see the community coming together. And we in our office have expanded to not just represent people in criminal cases, but try to also and successfully defeated this injunction by the city attorney's office.
That's great. It kind of just reminded me, I think I was just kind of moving down to the Bay Area, the Oakland gang injunctions causing nightmares here locally. It took a while to get those overturned as well. Kat, in May and June 2020, so people all across the country took to the streets to protest the May 25 murder of George Floyd. And there were calls to defund the police and reimagine public safety at all levels of government across the country, not just the Bay Area. And today we're really not seeing results. What happened? I think we anticipated the backlash, but why was it so successful so fast?
I mean, not to be cliche, but America happened. I wasn't surprised about the backlash, right? That's a cyclical thing. I think it's also really important to note that while we were able to get, promises of shifts, commitments to Black life from people that sit in elected seats, the vast majority of those elected, is not that they had some massive shift of consciousness. They were responding to the only thing that electeds respond to, and that's pressure in the streets. And then, of course, there was the economic pandemic that came on the heels of the coronavirus pandemic that exacerbated not only pre-existing medical conditions, but pre-existing social conditions, right? And so all of the things that were wrong and unjust and unfair and inequitable in Black and brown communities that created situations of desperation, housing insecurity, food insecurity, all of those things were exacerbated by both, not just the economic pandemic, but the psychological pandemic, right? And one of the things, and there's actually been some reporting on it lately, is about the gazillions of dollars, right, that law enforcement pours into communication strategies, communications agencies, and they were successful. And I can't prove it, right? And one day we'll do a FOIA, but I believe that there was a nationally coordinated communication strategy to manipulate the fear, pain, and trauma of folks that were really living inside of these horrific conditions, right? To push back on defund. And essentially we saw, like in Oakland, we saw mayoral administrations team up with police chiefs like Libby and LaRon, teamed up and lie basically to the community and blame what was happening in the community on defund that actually never happened, right? So here in Oakland, we know that the police department actually got 38 million more dollars. And then elected officials, more concerned about keeping their seats and keeping the people actually safe, went along for the ride. And so that's what we saw. And it's interesting too, Brian, because they released these polls that said, when you talk to Black people in the most impacted communities by things like homicide, they don't want to defund the police. Sure, if that's the only question you ask them. Right? But if you go back to those exact same communities like we did and Raheem did and other organizations across the country did, you ask them, do you want more investment in housing, food security, education, trauma supports, all the things that we know actually keep us safe? Absolutely. And once they understand that the only way that that's going to happen is to take the money from bloated police budgets, everybody's on board with defund. And so I think it was, sort of a perfect storm, and I think that our communities are in a place of high intensity that we haven't seen in a really long time. I think also the state does an amazing job of creating the conditions that they then say that they are the only protection for us from. But I wouldn't say that it was a total loss, to be honest with you, right? One of the things that I'm holding on to and I'm looking at is that I think the ship for who responds to things like mental health crisis has sailed, right? Even in the face of the backlash, money is being diverted from law enforcement agencies, is being put into civilian response to community crisis, and that's the momentum that we'll continue to build upon.
That's great. That is accurate. We are seeing civilianizing, traffic stops, mental health responders, even the movement against pretextual stops. So yeah, there are definitely wins, and I'm glad you highlighted that. Laura, partly we're talking about depressing stuff, so pull on our heartstrings a little bit. Explain the recent exoneration, and if I mispronounce his last name, my apologies, Joaquin Syria. And what is the mission of the San Francisco, I guess it's implied in the name, but what are you doing at the San Francisco District Attorney's Innocence Project?
Thank you, Brian. It's also just an honor to be here with Mano and Kat. So I'm happy to tell the story, and it is good news. To back up a little bit, when this district attorney, Chesa Boudin, was elected, there hadn't been a collaborative exoneration involving the district attorney's office in San Francisco ever. And in fact, what the DA was really good at doing was just reflexively opposing anybody who was trying to get out of prison, saying that they were innocent, because that's what DAs generally do. This DA really believed in examining those claims closely. And so what he did was create an independent outside panel of experts to review these claims. And he appointed 5 people, including me. And I guess because I'm the academic, I also got to chair it, because, academics, we love a committee and administrative work. So I was really fortunate to be also with retired Judge LaDoris Gordell, with Jaku Wilson, who is with the Public Defender's Office and has been, I think, almost 20 years now, and is just an unbelievable attorney that we could have an entire podcast about. Arcelia Hurtado, who is the head of the DA's post-conviction unit, Dr. George Woods, and me. So we spent about 5 months investigating this case from the ground up, and we interviewed witnesses, we got experts, and at the conclusion of that, we determined that Joaquin Syria was innocent of the murder that he was convicted of committing in 1991, and he has been incarcerated ever since. So we recommended to the DA in some very detailed findings that he go to court and concede on that issue. And in fact, that is what the district attorney did. People sometimes don't understand that the DA has a twofold responsibility. They have to hold guilty people accountable, but there's an obligation on them affirmatively to establish innocence and rectify wrongful convictions. And so that's what happened on April the 18th. Judge Brendan Conroy overturned the conviction. And 2 days later, Joaquin Syria walked free into the arms of his son, who he hadn't seen in the free world since his son was a year old. And this is kind of unbelievable, but the first thing that Mr. Syria said, and this is someone who is a Mariel Boatlift refugee from Cuba, he said, this is a great country. And then the second thing that he said was, I'm profoundly grateful to the district attorney and to the Innocence Commission. And of course, for the 5 of us, that was really gratifying and vindicating that we got to be a part of a process that was really designed to redress deep systemic harms. So that is, I guess, the long story of the exoneration of Joaquin Syria. And you pronounced his name perfectly.
Great. Occasionally I do something correctly. Kat, and I forgot to mention in your bio, my apologies that you do, and I still have no idea how they let you do this, but the Chronicle actually gave you column space. When I'm pretty frustrated in, myself with the Chronicle lately, the New York Times, a lot of these news, mainstream news reporting orgs, in my opinion, and I think a great many others, they're selectively reporting certain types of crime. They're ignoring major crimes which impact, potentially millions of people. For example, like the mortgage crisis, white collar crime. And they're trying to tell us, petty theft is the end of humanity. Why is this filtering or curated reporting harmful to our society? What are the potential negatives from that?
Right. Well, the first thing I want to say is I don't know how they let me do it either. And I legit keep waiting, right, for the email from my editor to be like, hey, that column was it, we're done. And not for nothing, but there are certain mayoral administrations in police officer associations that write the Chronicle every time one of my colleagues comes out and yells at them to fire me. That said, I mean, Brian, some of it goes back to a lot of it goes back to what I was saying, before about this is a coordinated strategy, and there is a narrative that has to play out in order for the status quo to maintain the status quo, and mainstream media has long played a role in that. There's a film you mentioned that I work, as a co-host for KPFA. And I can't think of what the film is, unfortunately. But anyway, it's got one of the guys from the Young Turks in it. And the film is about government control over media, right? Even inside of a so-called democracy. And it's about when they were on MSN and they were going hard, as they do. And they got pulled into, their higher ups office and told that the White House didn't like what they were saying on their show and that they needed to tone it down, right? And this is just like 10, 15 years ago. So that interplay absolutely happens. And, often the Chronicle sometimes reads like a Libby Schaff or a London Breed press release. APTP recognized, I come from a communicators background. That was actually my first sort of real job out of college, was as a communications person. And so APTP we recognized early on, right, that if it wasn't just that communications, if we were going to win, right, communications had to be as focused on as organizing, right? That communications actually is an organizing strategy, because he who controls the narrative, right, controls the minds of the people, and often, controls the win. And so there's this tug of war you see happening, and we have been successful. And I mean, we as the movement, right, on shifting the narrative, even in the face of so much propaganda that gets pushed out, not just by mainstream media, but in the movies, on television shows, on billboards, everywhere you look. We've been successful in pulling some of that power away from them. But when our papers lie to us, when the media lies to us, lies to a community that is dependent on them for information. I mean, the implications are playing out in San Francisco right now. We see what's happening with Chesa, right? And the way that truth is being manipulated. We see people acting against their own interests. It's not in the interest actually to give police more money, right? That's not what's actually going to keep us safe. But if you're told enough times by this entity that's supposed to not be part of the political machine, that's supposed to be, in theory, not biased, that this is what's real, right? If you don't have someone actively banging another drum, that's what you're going to believe. It's detrimental to organizing, and it's detrimental to the lives of Black and brown and poor folks, which is also why it's so important that we have our own independent media. It's important that podcasts like this exist. The question, becomes like, how do we get podcasts like this to the people that need to hear the information the most?
Brian, can I piggyback on what
Please.
Mr. Basil and Laura said before, and what Kat just said? And it is an honor to be on this podcast with all three of you. It just really struck me, and I think that was the point of Laura's story, that Laura's story is just the largest of spirit of someone coming out, not to be bitter about the fact that spent 22 years in for a crime that he did not commit, but rather that act of gratitude. And I think I just want to note that for a moment, and I've seen that time and time again when people are coming out, just that largest of spirit. And sometimes I feel if people could just talk to people who were incarcerated, or talk to people as they're coming out, and know that we could change so much. But because, as Kat's pointing out, the narrative is controlled by other forces and people are just lumped in various categories, those conversations never happened. But also, let's go back to 1991 and what happened. What did that prosecutor do to secure that conviction? Did his defense attorney have the resources to avoid that conviction? Did we have a diverse enough jury to see all the dynamics there? All of that. And because the reality is there's wrongful convictions happening every day in this country as we speak. There are people pleading to things they should not plead to across this country. And often that's because of the, pretrial detention, because of this concept of overcharging. The same act can be charged either as a misdemeanor or 2 or 3 strikes, and trial taxes, where judges and prosecutors throughout the country will intimidate people into pleading guilty And when that happens, we never have this opportunity often to go back and do the innocence work that the Innocence Commission did here. So this, while it's wonderful that this happened, it's also an illustration of all the work that has to be done to hopefully prevent more of these convictions on the front end. And referring to what Kat was saying earlier, I think the question that's being asked is so important. To her point, if you just ask the question, should the police be defunded, maybe that's not enough. But if you say, listen, you're concerned about public safety, or you're concerned about community health, what if instead of more police to arrest people for some undetermined amount of time so that people can go back, you had in every arraignment courtroom an on-the-ground public defender case manager, boots on the ground, who with the protection of the Fifth Amendment could gather information from people, because there's a lot of people come in, there's that churn where some people the district attorney may not file, maybe they would get released on the first day, maybe it resolves for a misdemeanor. This group never gets those services. But what if you had a boots on the ground case manager there who's asking the questions, where are you sleeping tomorrow? Can I get you connected to a class at City College? Can I get you some job training? Substance abuse counseling, alcohol counseling, childcare related issues, a mentor. And I know what part of town you can go to. And if you can't get in there, don't worry, I'll call and you can get into the program because I know who to call. If you had a boots on the ground case manager in each arraignment courtroom connected to a public defender's office who really knew how to connect places, that would do so much more for this concept of public safety, which I like to call community health rather than public safety, because it often implies protecting the public against someone. And I think we're all part of the community. That would do so much more for community health at a fraction of the cost of more law enforcement. And if you told people, would you rather fund this? Then that, most people would say absolutely yes. And whenever I talk about this concept, people do say it. And we put that in our budget as this year. And hopefully we receive those. But I think those are the kind of questions we need to ask. And I think Kat pointed that out very well. It's not just the question of should we defund, but what are we funding to replace that? And I think a lot of people, if asked those questions, would say absolutely yes.
Absolutely, man. I love that thought. I'm sorry, but I'm just going to jump in there real quick. The other piece of the conversation is around defund is also prevention, right? What does it mean to stop the incident from happening in the first place, right? And I at this point, I feel like I've said it so much, it's boring, but really, like, what does it mean to get to the gun before the bullet flies, as opposed to standing with another mother, right, as she puts her child in the ground? And if in theory, right, mayors and police officers and us, the community, want safe communities, then why would anybody fight putting money into preventing incidents from happening in the first place? And when you ask those questions to the folks that are impacted by the violence of policing in the carceral state, right, light bulbs start to go off. When you ask them, why would the police chief fight $18 million, a mere drop in the bucket, going into making sure people don't die, our people don't die in the first place? Who is profiting from your death? Why do they want to maintain the status quo? Right? People start screaming defund morning, noon, and night, right? And so that's another thing. Like, what would we fund instead? Well, we would fund things that stop, 6 foot graves from being dug in the first place. But people do profit off the crime, right? Police profit from bloated budgets. Private prison operators benefit from private prisons. And let's not be silly, right? Elected officials profit from donations from some of the biggest lobbyists, strongest, most powerful lobbyists organizations in the country.
Yeah, and surveillance technology vendors. Yeah. You reminded me of, picking on the Chronicle, they did publish, I believe it was an open letter from a Democratic strategist who was advising Democrats, one, they're going to probably get their butts kicked in the midterms, but start listening to victims of some of these violent crimes. They were not actually asking for punitive, mass incarceration type policies or more funding. They were talking more about restorative justice. And it really was, to emphasize the points many of you have been making, the questions that were being asked, the way you poll. If you presented different options, like, hey, rather than lock this guy up in jail for 30 years and, only bad things are going to happen, what if we did X, Y, Z? And most people chose those other options rather than, long time incarceration and harsher sentencing. And so at least maybe with some folks, this is gaining traction, that we are starting to maybe get a critical awareness that prevention is far more better than a reactive policing mindset. Manu, we're kind of stay on this, theme, Judge Jackson, recently Ted Cruz and other senators were essentially attacking her for being a public defender and for doing her job. Are things, is this a temporary blip? I know things are, cyclical. We've been through tough on crime things before, but does it appear to be getting worse? Or have we seen enough successes like bail reform and Prop 47 that, activists and community folks and impacted folks should actually be encouraged that, the needle's moving in the right direction?
First, let me say that I'm incredibly proud and excited that Justice Jackson is not only the first Black woman to become a Supreme Court justice, but also the first public defender. We waited a long time for someone in the highest court to be someone who has been representing the most vulnerable in our communities. And so I'm excited about that. One of the issues is that I'm the only elected public defender in California, and there's an elected sheriff and there's an elected district attorney in the ear of legislators throughout the state, but there's only one elected public defender. So part of what we need to do is I'm glad you invited me to this podcast. I'm glad all of these amazing guests is get some of the reality of the system out there. Because I think when people truly understand the dynamics that happens in courtrooms, they would believe in the importance of what we're trying to accomplish. Most people, even if they're on the conservative spectrum on these issues, I think that people should be convicted of things they didn't do. Most people do not think people should plead guilty just because they can't afford bail. I mean, most people that you talk to on the spectrum, I think, would agree with that if they're being honest with you. But the reality is racism runs very deep in our country. Policing in this country has its roots in upholding slavery and then later Jim Crow segregation. And it's no coincidence that our criminal laws, police, state, and carceral system expanded at the end of slavery. And it's no coincidence that even in the 13th Amendment, which generally prohibits slavery, there's a clause that allows for slavery and as a punishment for crime. So, and you're right, we are grossly underfunded when compared with the other players in the system. We're just over half of the district attorney's budget. We are 6 times less than the sheriff's department, 15 times less than the police department. So, and we don't have a whole, communications army like the police have. But I do think that, people still believe in some of the constitutional protections that we have, presumption of innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. What we need to do is make sure that we breathe life into those concepts and actually still make sure that, like Gideon's promise, we just celebrated Gideon Day in March, which ruled that every indigent person accused of a crime has the right to an attorney. But to me, it's got to be more than just an attorney. It's got to be a team that's fully able to really do the work that we need to do. And I think one thing that we have to do is we do have that outrage when we see the killing on the street, as we saw with George Floyd. We saw international protests. But the reality is there are things like that happen every single day in courtrooms. And the impact is obviously on that individual, but it's on their whole communities. And it's generational too. I mean, the next generation is impacted by that felony conviction. And we have to realize that our carceral system is actually punishing people who it was never even intended to punish. And I almost think the judges should be forced to say, when they say we're sentencing person A to this much time in custody, that they're also punishing that person's child's other parent to have to take time off work and have to do more of the parenting, because that's the reality of what's happening. That should be factored in. So we have to do, I think, a lot more to change the narrative, and we're starting to do that. We have our, as I said, the Adachi Project. If you go to wearedefender.com, we put out 3 short films so far, and we're going to continue to do that. But I do have faith that when people actually hear the other side, if we get these messages out there, that I have hope we can actually swing the pendulum in the right direction. And to your point, with Prop 47, with less pretrial detention, those are steps in that direction.
Laura, my major concern with this really one-sided, overwhelming media narrative right now is that it is dictating both policy, decisions and budget allocations. Our budget reflects our priorities. We've seen that in a great imbalance between the DA and prosecutor sides. So we seem to favor this punitive approach. In your past as a public defender, have you ever seen a prosecutor get, punished or eviscerated in the media for being too aggressive, too punitive, overcharging folks?
No, is the short answer. The longer answer is I came up in the federal system. So I was a federal public defender in Los Angeles, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for most of that time was controlled by Republican appointees. But actually, there was very little difference when it was Democratic appointees. The approach was overwhelmingly tough on crime. For a while, they had a policy of refusing to ever drop the top charge. They were generally pretty unreasonable in offering any kind of plea bargain. And then we had these sentencing guidelines in place that just sort of reified that punitive impulse. Words like progressive prosecutor, restorative justice, they didn't exist as far as these folks were concerned. And while those individuals are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, they never received any kind of pushback in the media. And that was certainly true also locally in terms of who was the DA in Los Angeles for all of the time that I lived there. It was just incredibly punitive and carceral. And actually, it's really interesting. Before George Gascon was elected, his predecessor, Jackie Lacey, I think she got something like 25 death sentences during her tenure. And mind you, this is after we had a moratorium on the death penalty. So no one was actually being executed. And every single person she secured a death sentence against was a man of color, every single one. So I don't see any of these people paying a price for policies that are expensive, are in the case of seeking these death sentences, quite frankly, ridiculous. And it is interesting to me that when you get reform-minded people in office, whether it's here in San Francisco or now in LA with George Gascon, or in Chicago with Kim Foxx, or in St. Louis with Kim Gardner, or in other jurisdictions, what they face is this incredible amount of blowback and really one-sided coverage in the media, where every time there's a high-profile tragic crime, and mind you, that is inevitable in any jurisdiction, no matter who the DA is, they are faulted for it. It's as if they went out and murdered the person themselves. So I find this weird causal connection that doesn't empirically exist, that the media is all too happy to draw between progressive prosecutors and crime, and even individual awful crimes, to be really, really dishonest. And I think they know it, and they know better. But what they're after are clicks and subscriptions and headlines, and I guess maybe going on places like Fox News and getting to pontificate. And it's sad.
So let's stay on that with me. On the flip side of that coin, is the narrative and the hysteria sort of impacting the bench? You mentioned earlier retired Judge LaDoris Cordell. She's become a really good friend and mentor to me. And I remember when she started raising the alarm bells about Aaron Persky. So that was the controversial Brock Turner rape case. He got beat up significantly in the media for following the established guidelines, and folks thought it was too lenient. And then the recall happened. Do you think that is going to lead to judges, being afraid to exercise discretion and potentially choosing the lower end of the sentencing guidelines?
Oh, it already has. I mean, there's a word for it. It's called the Persky effect. And I think probably Minot can speak to it more powerfully than I can, but it's absolutely undeniable. That recall sent a chill down the spine of every single judge in the state of California. There's just no doubt about it. And I share your admiration for Judge Cordell. Actually, that's how I got to know her too. She and I both were anti-recall in the case of Judge Persky. And as you point out, he was simply following the law and the recommendation of probation. That was literally what he was doing. And you would have thought, again, that he had committed the crime himself. And the way that he was pilloried and attacked, and his family was attacked, and he was basically run out of his office on a rail, was deeply disturbing on so many levels, including that it's just an attack on judicial independence. And you best believe that after that happened, every single judge has been looking over their shoulder ever since.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's, and once again, it has to do with looking at categories alleged categories of people defined by the charge, and and then whatever section of the penal code that falls under, as opposed to really looking at what are the facts here, what are the overall. Because so many times where people are commenting, they didn't see the trial, they didn't hear the witnesses, they don't know the full dynamics. And the reality is it's really about the details of the case. But what happens when you have that kind of effect is that because people are afraid that they're going to get hammered and judges are going to impose really harsh sentences, people end up pleading to things they shouldn't. That's the impact of that kind of effect of judges not being able to really exercise the discretion that they should.
So, Kat, keeping with this sort of theme of the mob energy, public outrage, I want to talk about agency capture, and what I mean by that is, I started burning some bridges locally, but those bridges were burned anyway because they're not doing their job.
You started burning bridges?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little late on that too. Hanging out with you too much. So I see the legislative bodies basically giving up, ceding their policy setting authority. They essentially let the administration dictate what they will and won't do. The police put out a policy that they drafted, it gets rubber stamped. And when I talk to folks, my activist friends in other parts of the country, they're stunned. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it appears to be far worse in California, at least according to their perspective. And I hold, especially here in the Bay Area, I hold, our elected Democrats, they're mostly registered Democrats, most of them profess to have progressive values. I hold them to a higher standard. If you say you have these higher values, then you better vote that way. And, going back again, when we ask you the defund and reimagine questions, does anybody have any other motive other than retaining their seat? I mean, where are we not supporting these folks with enough public pressure of our own? Like, why did our Bay Area Dem progressives cave pretty fast and unequivocally?
I want to get to that, but I do want to say you talked about like what happens in the media impacting the bench. I mean, I just want to point, really quickly to impacting of a whole trial, right? And what happened with the first police officer that was put on trial in San Francisco for violating the rights of someone that they're supposed to be protecting and serving. And that's Terrence Stengel, right? And then you saw what the chief did, accusing the district attorney's office of acting unethically, even though it never happened, but it was the night before jury selection. And ultimately we saw, Stengel walk. So I just think that's like such a clear-cut example of the power that the media has on our judicial system. I mean, Brian, I don't have a crystal ball. And I'm not psychic. So I can't tell you what's going on inside of the hearts and minds of some of our electeds. I will say that I think it's super important that we start differentiating between progressives and liberals, because there is a massive, huge difference. And a lot of folks want to profess to be progressive, right, while they're running. But if you look at the track records, or if you look at what they've been associated with, they're liberal. And in the case, I'll just use, Oakland's local officials, they're neoliberals, right? Not even liberal in the sense of the word that many, those of us on this call could stomach. I think the other thing, though, Brian, is look at the backlash. I mean, if you look at, and I don't want to call her out, right? Because I do still support her. So I don't know that I'm going to use the name, but if you look at one of our progressive folks that is sitting on Oakland City Council right now, and you look at where she stood around policing and around defund and around public safety, and you look at the racist, misogynistic, hateful, vile, violent attacks that she faced, I think some of it is fear-based, right? I mean, I get death threats and I get hate mail on a pretty consistent basis. And I'll tell you, that's a lot to carry. But when you feel like, right, like not just your political career, but your life, your families' well-being, those things are in jeopardy. And I think when you combine that with wanting to continue down whatever political career path, I think that that's part of it as well. I think too, I think it's why we see our sister Carol Fife having such a difficult time, right? Because it is, right, being in political office. I'm so glad I lost that race, right? I'm so glad that I lost that race. The amount of compromise, right? The amount of, okay, well, I'm going to tolerate a little of this injustice so that I can get just a little bit of this justice for my people that's required in order to sit in those seats is mind-blowing, right? And I've got a much closer look at it now than I ever had before. This institution, this country, our government, our policies, they're not rooted in creating equitable societies. They're rooted in protecting race-based capitalism. And at the end of the day, that's its job, right? And as long as that's its job and that's who's in power, we're going to continue to see what we see. And that's why elected office can only be one road. That is not the road to transforming society. That is not the road to building the world that we want to live in. That is a road. But also to your point, you're right. We elect people and then we bounce, right? Like we figure like we check the right box on election day. Now we can go on about our business and then we leave them inside of a cesspool. And that's one thing I say about, good cops, right? Or is there anything such thing as a good cop? It's not about people. And the truth is you cannot stand inside of a bathtub full of poison and not get sick. And I think that's as true for elected officials as is law enforcement officers.
Laura, the sort of the curated, filtering of the media reporting that I alluded to earlier, I'm kind of really trying to figure out sort of the motivation of the media orgs here. After that Walgreens video went viral, the guy, sweeping toiletries into a hefty bag and walking out, which, by the way, he was arrested. Somehow that didn't make the media. But somebody tracked it down. There was over 3,000 media references across the country to that video. Also involving Walgreens and San Francisco. A month later, Walgreens settled a wage theft claim for over $3 million. The guy stole like $60 worth of toiletries. The $3 million theft, one story behind a Bloomberg paywall. You alluded to it a bit earlier. Is it really just, it's the profit motive that these big, large, media orgs, they just want the clicks, they want the ad revenue. And since it's, I guess the corporations buying the ads, they want to keep those guys happy. Is it journalists are, all racist? What is driving these folks to portray our society through a certain lens?
It's a combination of things. So those are two great stories to put side by side. If you and I are thinking about the same Walgreens video, I believe it was viewed 3 million times. So what you have is this viral video, and it's this weird feedback loop where the more it gets viewed and the more outrage builds up, the more the media is going to want to cover it because they know that people are going to click on that story and maybe even subscribe to their struggling paper. At the same time, you have this massive problem with wage theft, which is impoverishing hardworking, working class Americans across the country, and certainly here in San Francisco. And you would think that that would be a story that people would care about. Of course, to cover that story, you really need to understand what wage theft is. You need to be able to break it down in a way that's understandable to people who are reading, and you need to create a narrative. And that involves actual shoe leather reporting and the hard work of going out and interviewing people and reading up about the law and how it gets broken and how this stuff is getting prosecuted. It's much, much easier to just watch a video, interview a bunch of outraged people, and type out 800 words and go home. And I think part of the other problem is journalism, especially local journalism, is really dying. This whole model that used to exist where you could have long form investigations done by local reporters is not happening as much anymore at all if the local media exists in the first place. And so because you are talking about people now who are clinging to their jobs, if they even have them, and are being asked to produce clickbait-worthy articles rather than actually investigating, the whole model is geared toward latching on to the crime of the day and then writing these screeching headlines and hoping that people pay attention. So the whole way that journalism is getting done, and this is the result really of the internet and freeing the news from advertisement. So in a way, it's good because it's democratized the news and we all have more access to it. But I think in terms of the kind of journalism it produces locally, it's actually been pretty terrible.
As a free speech advocate, I'm and someone that deals with a lot of just policy writing, social media, surveillance technology. Like, I'm getting very nervous about calls for content filters, that so far aren't even close to working, and they are suppressing First Amendment protected speech. Are you, and we don't know a lot about it yet, but just the sort of concept and the press release that's come out about President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board, sounds creepy to me. Sounds a bit Orwellian. Are you a thumbs up or thumbs down to some sort of, I guess I'm interpreting this as a regulatory approach to the disinformation that's really hitting us these days? Should there be some sort of other sanctions for falsifying statistics or lying? I mean, lying isn't generally illegal, but it is certainly harmful.
I am a hard no on the Ministry of Disinformation, and I'm angry with you that you took Orwellian before I could say it. I have to copy you. I think it is an outrageous idea, and the person who they're putting in charge went out and said that her intention was to edit what people said on Twitter to give it more context, which is ridiculous. I think this idea that we should put the government in charge of what we can and cannot say is absurd. I'd rather have lies being spread and then being able to be checked by truths than having the government tell me what is and isn't true. I mean, think about, just back up and take any recent example. This is the same government that told us that Saddam Hussein was the mastermind behind 9/11 and that WMDs would be found in his country justifying a war. And they're the same people who are going to be telling us what's true and false. I don't think so.
As you're having this discussion, if I can jump in here, I think it's also important that we make the connections. Like when you talk about wage theft, that wage theft is what leads to more poverty, and what more poverty is what leads to the Walgreens theft of toiletries, right? So, and that's why what's really a much more vital issue is the wage theft, but because it's invisible and because it can't be, filmed and put on, Instagram immediately, it doesn't, and on the news media, it doesn't have the cachet. But that's the kind of connections that I think we, as we organize, have to start making, and which is the same reason, like we're so, we have our magic programs, as Kat was alluding to earlier, Be Magic in the Bayview, Mo Magic in the Fillmore, which are designed to keep people safe, to engage youth so that they don't wind up, getting killed or hurt or caught up with the system. And that's why our Clean Slate program is so important, because we want people, with clean records so that they can get gainfully employed, so that someone, so they can pay for example, these toiletries, or someone can buy their nephew an iPhone. So someone who's desperate doesn't have that impulsive moment where they're taking it out of someone's purse. And I think it's really important that we start drawing these connections and showing the direct impact on, what people claim to be concerned about.
Kat, give us an organizing strategy. If one is working right now, you and I often are in the same space. We recently co-published a PhD peer-reviewed white paper showing that license plate readers were essentially statistically invisible. We've been losing the sort of the privacy argument because of the narrative, but I was like, all right, well, let's go to efficacy. We're going to show these very educated, very electeds that it actually doesn't even work anyway. So even if you don't care about privacy, why are you wasting money? And it just fell on deaf ears because that media narrative, which you mentioned earlier, and going to our good friend Carol Fife, she's like, man, she goes, the barrage is it's nonstop. We just have to do something, even if that something doesn't work. What can we do to convince people we're not, when even the FBI says we're not all dying of murder, but the people still don't believe it. How do we connect with the streets? How do we tell these people we're not all dying? Things aren't as bad as you believe, and here's the reality and the different direction for us to move forward.
We engage in the definition of the most bastardized word of our movement time: organizing. We organize, and organizing is not just calling protest. Organizing is certainly not, a Twitter post or a Facebook post. Organizing is a craft. It requires being on the ground with the people. It requires being in conversation with the people. It requires, this idea that you get paid for this work, right? Sort of blows this is a brand new concept, right? Like most of us came up working a 9 to 5 and then what I call our 5 to 9. That is the only thing that is going to get us to where we need to go. The organizing, being inside community, meeting community where they're at, letting the people dictate the agenda. You're not dictating the agenda to them, building power, right? And leveraging that power to force qualitative change in the conditions in our community. That's it. That's all. And the right knows that. And they are pumping out organizers faster than we can count, which is why we are losing local elections everywhere, because they've zeroed in on the strategy and they're using organizing methodology to win. And on the left now, mind you, we're reacting to way more fires, right? And dealing with just trying to survive, particularly when you're talking about Black and brown and impacted people. We don't have the luxury of wealth and whiteness that they do, that frees them up for a lot of this. But if we don't start putting our resources, investments in time, in training, building and supporting organizers and organizing in its truest sense of the word, we're going to continue to lose. That's what I know, right? That's what I've been doing for 20 something years. That's the only thing that is ever going to work.
So we organized pretty well in San Francisco. In the summer of 2019, we got a groundbreaking surveillance technology ordinance passed, which had the first ban in the world, to my knowledge, on creepy facial recognition technology. Manu, the mayor, in that December temper tantrum, threatened to just go to the court of public opinion, go to the voting box and essentially put on a ballot measure that would gut that ordinance. And she's temporarily withdrawn that for now. She still has time on the clock to reintroduce it. And first, definitely want to say thank you. You were very strong in publicly defending that law in the media. But, this is the same mayor that said she's going to reallocate $100 million from the police towards Black groups in San Francisco. Didn't happen. Is she just being, a politician that is reading the room and wants to get her reelection? Or is this a long-term trend where San Francisco, the symbolic bastion of progressive values, is actually getting a lot more punitive across the entire city?
It's interesting. On the one hand, I think, sometimes when you, especially when you're in our field and you look at the images and then the things going by, I think we can get pessimistic and we can think that, hope is lost and there's this big slide back. But, Antonio Gramsci, in Prison Notebooks, he talked about pessimism of outlook, optimism of spirit. And I think as a public defender, I feel an obligation to be almost pathologically optimistic, because if I don't have hope, then we're in trouble, right? And I think as public defenders, we have to see that hope. And I do think it was, I was glad to oppose the ballot measure because we know that surveillance technology in the hands of law enforcement leads to invasion of privacy, racial profiling, targeting of Black and brown communities. But I do think, we were able to get this be the jury pilot through just approaching the Treasury's office. And we got this, and now we're going to have at least a first step towards diverse juries. Is it enough? No, absolutely not. We have to do more, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think the possibility for more of that is definitely there. And there's been, I've received support when I go and publicly talk about these issues. I've received support from electeds who think that makes common sense and it is a direction of equity that we need to move in. But I think that the organizing principle that Kat was talking about is really important. We recently brought over Angela Chan from the Asian Law Caucus, who ran their criminal justice reform project for a number of years. And one reason that I did that is she's a master at making sure that we have systems impacted people involved in the work that we're doing and getting groups together. We just had the pretextual stop press conference and the police commission meeting last week to try to, change policies around pretextual stops, and the community came together and really pushed for that. And I do think that when we do it in the right way, there's a lot of people here who have good intentions in this city, in the Bay Area. But I agree, are we organizing as effectively as we should? Are we putting people in the position to actually make things happen who have the right intentions? Because I think there's a lot of people with the right intentions who, when we actually bring real awareness to the issues, will be on the side of true change that's needed.
So we'll wrap up our thing here. One final question. Laura, in last November and December, and the pace is almost as hectic this year, but just those last 2 months alone, I was in 15 states testifying before either city councils or county boards. Everybody wanted, license plate readers, shot spot. Everybody believes the narrative we're all dying and that these technologies are going to, keep us safe. So with that in mind, and Mr. Syria, can we anticipate more wrongful convictions, as surveillance technology spreads pretty rapidly, and it appears police budgets are going to be increasing as well?
I think going back to the earlier point that was made really powerfully by Mano, we can expect wrongful convictions so long as we don't pour the adequate resources into making sure that people can be vigorously defended. We don't pour enough resources into making sure that prosecutors follow the law. And yes, to your point, that we misuse and abuse technology because we don't know its limitations or because it seems like an easy, fast way to secure a conviction against somebody that no one really cares about, or so society says. So yes, I continue to be extremely worried about a steady stream of these wrongful convictions. And I will say there's really no way to know how many there are, except I think most experts can agree that the ones we do find are really just the tip of the iceberg. So for all of those reasons, including the reasons that you raised in your question to me, I do remain deeply concerned. And I also think so long as we don't have people in power who are willing to take a hard look at those cases, or we throw them out of office, the problem is going to get even worse. And that also concerns me.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap up there. I want to say really appreciate your valuable insights and time. I know we're kind of all on the edge of our seats here with the upcoming potential recall of the district attorney and just the elections going on. So we'll probably keep in touch with you folks and maybe continue this conversation at a later date. But really want to say thank you again for all your time.